Draven Nightfall did not know he was rejecting the woman his kingdom needed to survive. To him, Elara Wren was only an Omega, a servant girl, a mistake the Moonbound ceremony had no right to make. So in front of 500 wolves, beneath the full moon and the sacred flame, the Alpha King raised his hand and said the words that shattered her before the court could. I reject you. For one breath, the entire Moonspire courtyard went silent. Then the laughter began. Nobles whispered behind jeweled hands. Celestia Ravemont smiled like she had already won. Lord Cashin watched with the calm satisfaction of a man whose plan had worked. But Elara did not beg. She did not collapse. She did not give them the tears they were waiting for. She only lifted her chin and walked away. And that was when the kingdom made its greatest mistake. Because the flame did not follow the king. It followed her. The moon did not bless the throne. It turned gold for the girl they had just humiliated. And by the time Draven's wolf whispered the truth he had tried to silence. By the time the silver moon turned gold, Elara was already gone. And the kingdom had no idea it had just laughed at the last living heir of the first Luna's bloodline. Subscribe now because Draven rejected an Omega, but the Moonbound Flame recognized a queen. The Moonbound ceremony had never once called the wrong name. That was what made the silence so unbearable. The courtyard of Moonspire Palace was built for moments exactly like this one, grand, cruel, and impossible to look away from. Black marble floors stretched from the palace gates to the ceremonial platform, polished so clean they held the reflection of the enormous full moon above the palace like a second sky beneath everyone's feet. Crimson banners lined the walls from stone arch to iron gate, each one embroidered in gold thread with a wolf's head mid-howl, their fabrics snapping in a wind that had gone completely still the moment Elara stepped into the sacred circle. She had felt it stop. The wind. As though the air itself was holding its breath to watch what happened next. 500 wolves filled the courtyard in rows behind velvet ropes and iron barriers. Noble families clustered beneath covered pavilions to the east, dressed in furs and silver jewelry, their faces angled toward the ceremonial platform with the particular hunger of people who had come to witness a coronation and were now watching something far more interesting. Warriors in black armor flanked the marble walkway in two silent lines. Temple priestesses stood along the northern wall in silver robes, their hands clasped, their eyes on the moonbound flame burning in its crystal brazier at the platform's edge. And at the center of all of it, tall, crowned, and as still as something carved, stood Alpha King Draven Nightfall. He wore black and gold. He always wore black and gold. The armor plates across his chest were etched with sun and wolf insignia, the royal crest of the Iron Fang throne. A crown of dark metal rested on his dark hair, its points catching the torchlight like something between a weapon and a symbol. His silver-gray eyes were fixed on Elara with an expression she could not name, not cruel, not satisfied, not even cold. Certain. That was the word. He looked certain, the way a king looks when he has already made his decision and is only now delivering it to the room. Lord Cashin Dreadmore stood 2 steps behind Draven's left shoulder, robed in deep burgundy, his silver beard immaculate, his expression arranged into something that looked like patience but was actually the careful neutral face of a man watching a plan succeed. And beside the platform, wearing a gown the color of deep water and a crown of woven gold, Celestia Ravemont. The court's chosen woman. The kingdom's expected Luna. She stood with her hands folded at her waist and her chin lifted at the precise angle that communicated confidence without effort, beauty without vanity, entitlement without the vulgarity of demanding it. She was watching Elara the way someone watches a candle they know is about to be put out. Elara felt all of it. The stairs, the torchlight, the silence pressing in from every direction like something physical. She felt the damp cold of her gown against her skin, pale lace torn at the hem where the crowd had stepped on it earlier that evening, the shoulders scratched with thin red lines from fingernails that had shoved her aside in the entrance corridor without looking back. Her dark hair was still wet from the storm that had swept through the valley at dusk. She had not been given time to change. She had not been given anything. She had simply heard her name called by the royal herald and felt her legs carry her forward before her mind could object. Elara Wren. The sound of it still rang somewhere behind her ribs. Her name, spoken in a ceremonial space where names meant something. Her name, which had never meant anything to anyone in this kingdom except as a placeholder for a girl whose presence required no acknowledgement. She had told herself to look at the flame, not at him. Looking at the flame was safer. The moonbound flame was real, sacred, ancient, and reliable in the way sacred things are reliable before they break your heart. It had never once bent toward an Omega. Except tonight it had. She had felt it. the warmth moving toward her before she had even reached the edge of the circle. The way the light shifted. The way Priestess Talia's hands had gone still at her sides for 1/2 second, like a woman who had just seen something she would need to reconsider. Elara had made the mistake of believing that meant something. Then Draven raised his hand. He extended one finger toward her, steady and final, as though pointing at her was not a choice that required any effort at all. His voice was not unkind. That almost made it worse. "I reject you, Elara." The silence came first. Then the High Priestess Talia Moonveil stepped forward in her silver robes, her voice carrying effortlessly across the frozen courtyard the way trained ceremonial voices carry, clear, formal, and irreversible. "Alpha King Draven Nightfall has spoken. The bond is denied." The whispers broke open. They moved through the crowd in waves, gasps first, then murmurs, then the thing Elara had been bracing for since the moment her name was called: laughter. It started near the eastern pavilion where the noble daughters stood. She heard it before she saw it, a sound like something being dropped from a height, brittle and spreading, finding its rhythm quickly once the first voice gave it permission. Celestia raised one hand to her mouth. Her jeweled fingers covered the smile, but not the satisfaction in her eyes. Lord Cashin's expression did not change. It did not need to. A woman near the iron barrier leaned toward the woman beside her and said something that ended with Omega and began with "Can you believe?" And the woman beside her laughed in a way that confirmed she believed it completely, had always believed it, would go home and repeat it over breakfast. Elara kept her eyes forward. She had spent 22 years in this palace's shadow, 3 floors below the rooms that mattered, in the stone corridors where the light came through narrow windows and the floors stayed cold regardless of season. She had grown up the ward of Mother Nessa Wren, a woman of quiet hands and careful speech who ran the lower household staff with the efficiency of someone who had survived the palace long enough to understand its rules. Elara had learned those rules young. Move carefully, speak rarely, never reach for things that belong to other people's worlds. The Moonbound ceremony had belonged to other people's worlds. If the moon ever calls you, run from the light. Mother Nessa had said it once, years ago, in the kind of voice people use when they are saying something that is not entirely about the thing they are talking about. Elara had stored the warning without understanding it. She had carried it the way you carry something in a pocket and forget it is there until the moment it becomes the heaviest thing you own. She had not run. She stood in the circle. She felt the flame bend toward her. She made the mistake of hoping. And now the court was laughing, and Draven's arm was lowering, and somewhere to her right Celestia Ravemont was already straightening her gown and preparing to step forward into the space Elara was about to vacate. Elara lifted her chin. It was the only crown she had. The only thing in this courtyard that belonged to her and could not be taken by decree. She turned away from the platform. She did not look at Draven's face. She did not want to see the certainty there, not cruelty, not regret, just the calm resolution of a king who believed he had made the correct choice. She did not look at Celestia, who was already moving. She did not look at Lord Cashin, whose satisfaction was palpable even from a distance of 30 feet. She walked. Her footsteps crossed the black marble slowly, steadily, the way footsteps cross a room when pride is the only thing holding the bones together. The laughter continued behind her. She heard someone say "of course" and someone else say "did she actually think?" And then she stopped listening because the only way to survive a sound like that is to make it smaller than the sound of your own breathing. She reached the palace gates. She did not see the moon change. She did not see the moonbound flame tremble in its crystal basin, bending once in the direction of the gate, as though it had somewhere to be and the king was standing in its way. She did not see Draven's hand lower. She did not see the way he turned, just slightly, just an inch, as she disappeared through the iron arch. She did not see the way his wolf, Noctur, went rigid beneath his skin at the exact moment the gate swung shut behind her, going rigid the way an animal goes rigid when it has just made an irreversible error and knows it. She heard nothing of what came after. She did not hear Captain Rowan Blackmere, standing at the eastern edge of the ceremonial platform, say nothing to nobody, because Rowan never said things aloud when he was still deciding if they were true. But she would have known, if she had seen his face, that he was watching the crystal brazier with the expression of a man who had noticed something that did not match the story he had been told. The flame had not weakened when Elara approached. It had weakened when Draven rejected her. By the time Elara passed through the outer gates of Moonspire Palace and the stone walls swallowed her from the court's view, the silver moon above the Iron Fang Kingdom was already beginning to change. A ring of gold formed at its edge. Faint at first, a trick of the torchlight, the nobles would tell themselves later, a disturbance in the cloud cover, a reflection from the palace towers. Then brighter. Then unmistakable. the sacred bells in the high towers had no hands to ring them. They rang. The crimson banners snapped once in a wind no one in the courtyard could feel. And deep beneath the palace temple, in a vault that had been sealed for centuries, something very old felt the rejection travel through the sacred bond like a fracture moving through stone, and cracked open for the first time in 500 years. Elara was already gone. She had not seen any of it. She walked alone down the lower road beyond the palace gates, her torn gown dragging at the hem, the scratches on her arms beginning to glow faintly gold beneath the moonlight, though she did not look at them because she was too busy looking at the ground. She was the girl from the servant quarters. The forgotten Omega. The one with no name worth carving into stone. That was all she knew how to be. She did not know yet that being that girl had saved her life for 22 years. She did not know yet that the woman who had given her that life, Mother Nessa Wren, quiet and careful, with her cold floor corridors and her two specific warnings, had been keeping a secret that predated the Iron Fang throne itself. She did not know that her name was not truly Elara Wren. She did not know that somewhere inside her, sealed like a letter written to be opened only at the worst possible moment, a wolf named Solen was waking up. She only knew that the moon had called her, and the king had refused her, and the court had laughed. And that she had lifted her chin. That she had not let them see her break. She kept walking, following the low road out of the palace district toward the lower city, where the streets were narrow and the lights were ordinary and no one stood in sacred circles waiting to be chosen or discarded. Above her, the golden moon burned brighter. Behind her, the kingdom she had just left was beginning to understand that it had made a mistake it did not yet have the language to name. And far below the palace, in the sealed vault beneath the Moonveil Temple, the first line of an ancient prophecy burned itself visible in silver ash on a scroll that had been waiting, patient and certain, for exactly this night. When the throne rejects the blood that first blessed it, the moon shall withdraw its flame. The last dawn veil shall rise from shame. And the king who cast her out shall kneel before the truth he refused to see. The kingdom finally sees the first sign of what Draven has done, because the sacred bells begin to ring without hands, the moon burns gold, and Elara's hidden bloodline starts waking beneath her skin. Subscribe before the moon turns gold again, because the kingdom laughed when Elara left. But it stopped laughing when the sacred bells rang by themselves. And before Elara's hidden bloodline awakens, write in the comments where you are watching from. Let's see how far the first Luna story is traveling tonight. Celestia waited exactly 4 seconds after Elara turned away before she spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The courtyard was still quiet enough that the words carried perfectly, designed to, the way cruelty is always designed when it is practiced. I suppose even the moon has standards. The noble cluster to her left laughed. Light, delicate laughter, the kind worn like an accessory. A few warriors near the eastern barrier allowed themselves smiles. Lord Cashin's expression did not change, but his chin lifted slightly, the gesture of a man whose work had been done for him. Draven said nothing. Then the wind came. Not the kind of wind that builds, the kind that arrives. Cold and total and sourceless, sweeping through the Moonspire courtyard from no direction anyone could identify. The torches guttered. The crimson banners did not flutter this time. They snapped, all of them simultaneously, a sound like a dozen hands striking stone, and then fell completely still again. The laughter stopped. Above the palace, the golden ring around the moon had grown. It was not subtle anymore. It pressed outward from the moon's silver edge like something contained deciding it was finished being contained, burning with a color that had no business belonging to the night sky over Ironfang. Priestess Talia had gone very still beside the brazier. The moonbound flame was moving. Not flickering. Not reacting to the wind because there was no longer any wind. It was bending, leaning in a single direction, its sacred light stretching toward the western gate the way a compass needle finds north. The direction Elara had walked. Draven felt it before he saw it. Noctur hit the inside of his ribs like a fist. Not the restless stirring from earlier, this was the wolf's full weight, slamming forward, furious in a way that had no political solution. The scent of moonlit rain and old flowers moved through Draven's blood like a current moving against the tide of every decision he had just made. Wrong, Noctur said. Not in words. In the way a wolf communicates, through the gut, through the chest, through the throat. Wrong. 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 Draven pressed him down. He had made the right choice. The kingdom needed stability, not sacred sentiment. An Omega Luna would have made the throne a target. Cashin had said so. The council had said so. Draven had known it himself before Elara had ever stepped into the circle and made it complicated. He pressed Noctur down and kept his face composed. 14 feet away, Captain Rowan Blackmere was watching the brazier. He had been watching it since the moment the High Priestess made the announcement. He had watched it during the laughter and during Celestia's comment and during the cold wind that had no origin. And he had noticed something that no one else in the courtyard seemed to be tracking. Possibly because no one else was looking at the flame instead of the girl. The flame had not flinched when Elara approached the circle. It had responded. Reached. Recognized. It had only begun to falter at the exact moment Draven's voice had said, "I reject you," as though the flame had understood the words before the court did, and had decided they were wrong. Rowan filed this away in the particular silence he reserved for things that would matter later. Elara did not stop walking until she reached the outer steps beyond the secondary gate, where the palace grounds gave way to the lower road and the torchlight thinned into ordinary dark. She was cold. The torn lace of her gown offered nothing against the night air and less against the feeling of 500 pairs of eyes she could still feel on the back of her neck even now, even here. She looked down at her arms. The scratches, thin red lines left by the crowd that had shoved her aside in the entrance corridor, were glowing. Faint. Gold. Unmistakable. She pulled her torn sleeve down over them fast, her heart lurching sideways. She stood still for a moment, breathing carefully, telling herself it was the torchlight. A reflection. The moon playing tricks on damaged skin. She told herself this clearly and calmly and with the practiced conviction of a woman who had spent 22 years explaining away things she did not have the context to understand. Then she walked on. She did not look back at the palace. She did not look up at the moon. Behind her, Lord Cashin stepped close to Draven's ear. "The ceremony must continue," he said quietly. "Every moment of delay becomes a story by morning." Draven exhaled once. Nodded. But Noctur had gone silent inside him, not calm. Silent in the way that precedes something irreversible, the way a storm is silent in the second before it breaks. Elara passed through the outer palace gates. And then, from the high towers of Moonspire Palace, from the 4 sacred belfries that had not been touched by human hands since the night the first Iron Fang King was crowned, every bell rang once. No wind. No hands. Just once. Together. Clear and final, like a door being sealed from the other side. The courtyard went absolutely still. Even Celestia stopped smiling. Lord Cashin did not wait for the echo of the bells to die. "Your Majesty." His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had managed crises long enough to know that hesitation was its own kind of damage. "The kingdom is watching. Every second of uncertainty becomes a rumor by morning and a revolt by winter. Announce Lady Celestia now before fear takes root." Draven said nothing for a moment. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the western gate, the direction Elara had walked, though his expression gave nothing away. Noctur was still silent inside him. That silence was worse than the growling. "Continue the ceremony," Draven said. Celestia moved to the platform the way she had rehearsed, not that she would have admitted rehearsing. Her gown caught the torchlight as she ascended the marble steps, the deep blue fabric shifting like water, the gold crown at her brow catching every eye in the courtyard the way it was designed to. She was composed. Radiant. Built for exactly this moment, shaped by a lifetime of preparation for precisely this stage. The nobles straightened as she passed. She heard the murmurs shift register, relief, approval, the exhaled tension of a court that had been briefly unnerved and was now remembering what order looked like. Her family controlled 3 border armies and 2 of the oldest trade routes in the northern territories. Her bloodline had produced 2 council seats and 1 canonized Luna priestess. There was not a noble in this courtyard who did not understand what her ascension would mean for their own security. She gave them a small smile as she took her place before the Moonbound Flame. The brazier stood at the platform's edge, its crystal basin catching the golden moonlight from above. The flame inside burned low, lower than it should have been, Celestia noticed, though she filed this away without concern. Ritual fires fluctuated. Priestesses adjusted them. That was what priestesses were for. She raised her hand above the flame to receive the blessing. She looked once at the court, at the upturned faces, the anticipation, the rightness of this moment, and smiled. Then she lowered her hand toward the flame. The flame moved away from her. Not extinguished. Not flickering. It pulled back, contracted toward the far edge of the crystal basin the way a living thing pulls back from something that has burned it before. The light it cast changed shape entirely, retreating from Celestia's outstretched fingers as though her skin were a surface it refused to touch. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one after Elara's rejection. That silence had been stunned. This one was afraid. Celestia's hand remained extended for 3 full seconds above an empty space where sacred fire should have been. Then she lowered it. The composure on her face did not shatter, she was too well trained for that, but it cracked along a single line, visible only in the tightening around her eyes. Lord Cashin stepped forward before anyone else could react. "A disturbance in the ritual alignment," he said firmly, loudly, with the authority of a man who had decided what this meant before it finished happening. "The golden moon has disrupted the sacred calibration. It is a known phenomenon during celestial anomalies. Priestess Talia will reset the... It is not a calibration disruption." Priestess Talia's voice was quiet. That was what made it cut through everything else. She stood beside the brazier with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the flame, which was still pressed to the far edge of its crystal basin, still refusing. "Sacred flame does not recoil," she said. "It has never recoiled. Not in 500 years of ceremony." She paused. "Not until tonight." Lord Cashin's jaw tightened. "Priestess." "I know what I am looking at, my lord." Draven felt Noctur surge. Not toward the flame. Not toward the platform. Toward the gate. Toward the road beyond it. Toward the direction a pale torn gown had disappeared into the dark 20 minutes ago, trailing scratches and silence and a dignity that had cost more than anything in this courtyard was worth. Draven pressed his wolf down with everything he had. It was the right decision, he told Noctur. It was necessary. An Omega cannot hold the throne's blessing. The kingdom requires. Noctur turned away from him. Inside his own chest, his wolf turned its back. Rowan had not moved from his position at the platform's edge. He watched Celestia lower her hand. He watched Lord Cashin perform damage control. He watched Priestess Talia say the true thing in the quiet way true things are always said when rooms full of powerful people prefer a comfortable lie. He thought about Elara's face when she turned away from the platform. Not the pain, though the pain had been visible and he was not the kind of man who felt nothing watching it. He thought about the angle of her chin. The particular set of her shoulders. The way she had absorbed every laugh in that courtyard without letting a single one bend her spine. He thought about the flame leaning toward her like it recognized something. He thought about the flame recoiling from Celestia like it recognized something else entirely. Rowan filed none of this away. He had finished filing. He had moved, quietly and without announcement, into the territory of decision. The messenger arrived at a run. He came from the inner palace, young, temple-robed, his face the color of old ash. He pushed through the rear barrier and reached Priestess Talia before the guards could intercept him, and he bent toward her ear, and whatever he said made the priestess close her eyes for one long moment before opening them again. She turned to face the king. "Your Majesty." Her voice had not changed register. That steadiness was its own kind of warning. "The moonbound flame in the sacred temple." A pause brief waited. "It is dying." The Moonveil Temple existed at the heart of the palace the way a heartbeat exists at the center of a body, not decorative, not ceremonial in the political sense, but functional. Necessary. The thing everything else depended on without thinking about it. Draven had stopped thinking about it years ago. He was thinking about it now. The temple corridor was white stone and black marble, the walls lined with silver wolf statues that had stood in the same position since before his father's reign, their carved eyes fixed forward in expressions that had always read as vigilance and tonight read as accusation. Crystal braziers flanked the passage at measured intervals, their small flames burning low, lower than they should have been this far from the courtyard's disturbance. Faded murals ran the length of the northern wall. A woman in silver robes with one hand on a flame and one on a wolf's broad head, her face worn smooth by centuries of incense smoke and time. Draven had walked this corridor 100 times without looking at those murals. He looked at them now. The central chamber was cold. The moonbound flame, the sacred fire that had burned without interruption since the first Iron Fang king was crowned, fed by no wood, extinguished by no storm, dimmed by no passage of years, was shrinking inside its crystal basin. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It contracted the way a living thing contracts when something vital is leaving it, pulling toward its own center, giving off a light that was less gold than gray. Priestess Talia stood at the basin's edge with her hands clasped and her face composed in the specific way that people compose their faces when composure is costing them something. "How long?" Draven said. "Since the ceremony." She did not look at him when she said it. "It began the moment," she stopped. "Began again. It has been withdrawing for approximately 1 hour." Lord Cashin moved to the basin before Draven could speak. He studied the flame with the expression of a man auditing a ledger. Ritual fires fluctuate during celestial anomalies. The golden moon is an atmospheric disturbance. By morning the flame will. A guard entered from the eastern passage at a jog, armor catching the dim light. He bent toward Garrick Stormhall's ear. Garrick's expression did not change, but his shoulders set in the way shoulders set when news is bad and the room is already struggling. He turned to Draven. 3 reports from the city. Warriors in the lower district cannot shift. 2 Luna candidates have collapsed. Physical pain, no external cause. Border scouts at the northern pass are sending signals. The Ashvale pack has begun moving in the mountain corridors. The room went quiet. The Ashvale pack had not moved in 11 years. They moved when they sensed weakness the way scavengers sense it, not by observation but by something older. Something the wolves of Iron Fang had always carried that kept rival packs at a respectful distance. Whatever that thing was, it was leaving. Explain this, Draven said to Talia. His voice was even. That was the most dangerous version of his voice. Priestess Talia finally looked at him. Something sacred was cast out tonight, she said. The words landed in the cold air of the temple and did not dissipate. They stayed. Draven felt them the way you feel a truth you are not ready to hold, not in the mind but lower, in the chest, in the place where Noctur had gone silent and stayed silent since the gate closed behind Elara. She is an Omega. Lord Cashin's voice was immediate and sharp. With no bloodline, no wolf strength, no recorded lineage worth examining. Your Majesty, I urge you strongly, do not allow superstition to frame tonight's events. Weakness invites interpretation. If the court believes an Omega girl has the power to destabilize this kingdom by simply being rejected, you hand your enemies a story they will use for a generation. Draven said nothing. Garrick Stormhall spoke quietly from his right. Not to the room. To Draven. Investigate her background. Quietly. If there is nothing to find, then nothing is found and Cashin is correct. Pause. But find out. Captain Rowan was already gone. He had left the temple corridor before the reports arrived, moving through the palace's lower passages with the particular efficiency of a man who had decided something and was no longer deliberating. The servant quarters were 3 floors below the ceremonial wing, past the kitchen passage and the linen storage and the narrow staircase that nobles never used because it had no railing worth mentioning. He was looking for a woman named Mother Nessa Wren. He was looking for her because he had watched the Moonbound Flame bend toward Elara like recognition, and recoil from Celestia like refusal, and he was finished pretending those were the same category of event. Behind him, in the temple's deepest wall, a section of white stone that had been sealed so long the mortar had calcified into something closer to bone than building material, a crack appeared. Not from impact. Not from age. From the inside. It ran from floor to ceiling in a single clean line, and from within it came a light that was neither the gold of the changed moon nor the gray of the dying flame. It was silver. And it was very, very old. Mother Nessa Wren had always known this night would come. She had simply hoped she would be wrong. Rowan found her in the lower city, 2 streets beyond the palace's servant gate, in the narrow room she kept as a second residence for nights when the palace felt too close. The door was unlocked, not from carelessness but from haste. Inside, a traveling case lay open on the bed. Folded cloth. A small box of documents. A bundle wrapped in old silver fabric that she moved, with deliberate casualness, beneath a folded shawl the moment Rowan stepped through the door. He noticed. I'm not here to detain you, he said. Mother Nessa was a small woman with careful hands and gray-threaded hair and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades making themselves easy to overlook. She looked at Rowan the way she had probably looked at every palace guard for 22 years, measuring the distance between what he knew and what he was about to ask. Then what are you here for, Captain? Elara Wren. He said it plainly. I need to understand who she is. She is an Omega from the servant quarters. The words were practiced. Smooth in the way only rehearsed things are smooth. She has no bloodline of consequence, no. The Moonbound Flame is dying. The rehearsed smoothness stopped. Mother Nessa stood very still for a moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and something in the set of her shoulders shifted, not collapsed but released. The way a door releases when the latch finally gives. How long, she said quietly. Since the rejection. She closed her eyes. She spoke without looking at him. Elara had not been born in the servant quarters. She had not been born in the palace at all. On the night of a blood moon 22 years ago, a woman had come to Mother Nessa's door in the lower city. A priestess from the Dawnvale Sanctuary, one of the last, wounded badly enough that she had tied her own robes around her side to slow the bleeding. She had carried 3 things. A length of silver-wrapped cloth, a broken pendant on a cord, and an infant girl too quiet for her age, as though she already understood that silence was survival. The priestess had died before dawn. Before she died, she had pressed the pendant into Mother Nessa's hands and said 7 words. "Hide the child where pride will never look." Mother Nessa had looked at the infant. She had looked at the pendant. She had understood, with the clarity of a woman who had spent her life in proximity to powerful people, exactly what kind of hiding was required. Not a forest sanctuary. Not a distant village. Not a sympathetic noble house. The servant quarters of the palace that had hunted the child's bloodline into extinction. "I let the world believe she was mine," Mother Nessa said. "Lowborn. Unremarkable. An Omega with no history worth recording." She paused. Being ignored kept her alive. Being mocked kept her safe. The people who were searching for the last Dawnvale heir were not searching the servant corridors. They were not looking at girls that nobles step around without seeing. She looked up at Rowan then, and her eyes were dry in the way that eyes are dry when the grief inside them is older than tears. Her invisibility was never her shame, she said. It was her shield. Rowan crossed the room and crouched beside the bed. He lifted the edge of the folded shawl. The pendant was silver, tarnished, its chain broken cleanly as though snapped by force. The design on its face was a crescent flame, encircled by wolf markings in a style that predated the current Iron Fang crest by several centuries. He had seen that crest once before. In an archive. In a record that the council had classified and quietly removed from public access 11 years ago. He stood. The bloodline was believed extinct. Believed, Mother Nessa said. Not confirmed. There is a difference. And the people who hunted them knew the difference very well. Rowan looked at the pendant for a long moment. Then at the door. Then back at Mother Nessa. Where is she now? I don't know. For the first time real fear moved through her voice. She left the palace grounds. She does not know what she is. She has never known. I kept her from knowing because knowledge would have made her visible. She stood, her hands pressing flat against her thighs. If she is in danger, I'll find her, Rowan said. He was already moving. Elara had not chosen the Moonvale forest. She had simply followed the light. It had appeared on the lower road perhaps 20 minutes after she left the palace. Faint, gold-edged, hovering at the treeline the way candlelight hovers at the edge of a window, not beckoning exactly, but present in a way that felt directed. She had told herself she was not following it. She had followed it. The forest was old in the way that certain places are old, not aged but prior, as though it had existed before the kingdom was built around it and would exist after. Silver flowers grew along the root lines of trees she could not name. Ancient stones rose from the earth at intervals, their surfaces worn smooth and faintly luminescent. The golden moonlight fell differently here, not reflected but received as though the forest had been waiting for it. Elara stopped at the edge of a hidden pool. The water was perfectly still. In its surface she saw the moon and the trees and her own face, wet-haired, scratched, tear-streaked in the places she had not noticed crying. Then the voice came. Not from the trees. Not from the water. From somewhere closer than either. Somewhere that felt impossibly like the inside of her own chest. Elara Dawnvale. She had never heard that name before. But her bones recognized it. The vault had not been opened by human hands. That was the first thing Draven registered when Priestess Talia led them through the crack in the temple's deepest wall. Now wide enough to pass through, the ancient mortar crumbled to fine dust at its edges, the stone pulled apart from the inside as though something long compressed had finally exhaled. No tool marks. No forced hinges. Just a door that had decided, after 5 centuries of waiting, that the right moment had arrived. The chamber beyond was small and without windows. The air inside carried the smell of silver ash and old ink and something beneath both of those things that Draven could not name, something that felt less like a scent and more like a frequency, a vibration that settled into the back of his teeth and did not leave. The walls were covered in murals. Not the faded, smoke-worn images of the temple corridor. These were precise, pigment still holding, lines still clean, as though the sealed air had preserved them outside of time. A woman in silver robes dominated the northern wall, tall, dark-haired, her face carrying the particular quality of stillness that artists reach for when they are trying to paint authority without aggression. Her left hand rested on a flame burning in a crystal basin. Her right hand rested on the broad head of a silver wolf, its eyes open, its posture not submission but partnership. Beside her stood a man in black and gold armor. Draven recognized the crest. It was his. Master Orion Holomir arrived at a run, still pulling his archive robe straight, his reading spectacles catching the dim light. He was the kingdom's oldest living prophecy scholar, 70, precise and constitutionally incapable of softening information he considered accurate. He stopped at the threshold of the vault and looked at the murals for a long moment. Then he crossed to the stone table at the chamber's center, where a sealed scroll lay in a basin of silver dust, its surface covered in two inks, one the gray-white of ash, one the deep brown-red of blood long dried. He did not touch it immediately. He read its outer casing first, lips moving silently, and then he looked at Draven with an expression that contained no comfort whatsoever. He broke the seal and read. The scroll spoke of Auraline Dawnveil, the first Luna, the woman in the mural. It spoke of the original covenant between her bloodline and the Iron Fang throne, a covenant that predated every council, every noble house, every political alliance that had been built in the centuries since. The throne had not been established by alpha dominance alone. It had been established by balance, alpha strength and first Luna mercy, bound together through the Moonbound Flame, which answered to both or answered to neither. The Dawnveil bloodline was not a tradition. It was a structural requirement. Orion cleared his throat once and read the warning aloud. When the last Dawnveil heir is rejected by the Alpha throne, the moon shall turn gold, the flame shall withdraw, and the king's wolf shall turn against his pride. The vault was very quiet. Draven stood without moving. Somewhere in the architecture of his chest, behind the composure and the crown and 20 years of learning to hold a room with stillness, something was coming apart. Not loudly. The way foundations come apart. Invisibly at the base where no one thinks to look until the floor moves. Lord Cashin spoke first. Ancient records are symbolic architecture. Metaphor dressed as prophecy. This text has likely been altered by. I will need a blood confirmation. Priestess Talia's voice did not rise. It never rose. Before this room leaves this chamber as interpretation, I will need confirmation. Cashin turned to her. On what basis? On the basis that I am the keeper of the sacred flame and this is my jurisdiction. She looked at him with the particular patience of someone who has decided they are done being interrupted. Not yours, my lord. The door of the vault opened behind them. Rowan entered. He carried a broken pendant on a cord and a length of silver-wrapped cloth folded over one arm. He crossed the chamber without explanation and placed both on the altar beside the scroll. From Mother Nessa Wren, he said. Elara's infancy wrappings. And the pendant she was carried with. Priestess Talia examined the pendant, the crescent flame, the ancient wolf markings, and then turned to the altar. From the small ceremonial pouch at her belt she removed a folded cloth. Inside it, dried, not the gray of the dying flame. Not the gold of the changed moon. Silver white and absolute, rising from the altar's stone face and spreading upward along the mural walls until Auraline Dawnveil seemed to breathe, seemed to lean forward from 5 centuries of pigment and patience. In the center of the altar, written in the same silver ash ink as the scroll but written now, written live letter by burning letter, a name appeared. Elara Dawnveil. Nobody spoke. Lord Cashin had gone the color of old wax. Garrick Stormhall stood with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the altar, his face doing the particular work of a loyal man revising everything he thought he understood. Orion Hollowmere removed his spectacles and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Draven looked at the name until the silver light began to fade. He had rejected an Omega. He had rejected the last living heir of the bloodline his throne was built on. He had pointed at her in front of 500 wolves and said the words cleanly and felt certain, and his certainty had been the most expensive mistake in Ironfang's history. The composure held on his face because composure was the last thing he had left. Then Noctur moved. Not against him. Not in anger. The wolf pressed forward from the inside with the slow, irresistible weight of a tide, and forced one word up through Draven's chest with the clarity of something that had been true since the moment Elara stepped into the sacred circle. Meh. Draven closed his eyes. The pool was not on any map. Elara was certain of this the way you are certain of things you cannot explain, not because she had studied the Moonveil Forest cartography, but because a place like this did not exist on maps. Maps were made by people moving through landscapes they wanted to record and return to. This place felt like it had been waiting for one specific person to arrive, and had no interest in anyone else finding it afterward. The water was perfectly still. The silver flowers growing at its edges, small, luminescent, blooming against all reasonable season, reflected the golden moon without distortion. Ancient stones rose from the forest floor around the pool in a rough circle, their surfaces worn smooth and faintly warm beneath her fingertips when she reached out to steady herself against one. She was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that lives below the muscles, in the place where dignity has been holding everything together through sheer refusal. She looked down at the water. Her own face looked back. What haired? Scratch. Eyes red at the edges from tears she hadn't fully admitted to crying. Then the reflection changed. Not gradually. Between one breath and the next, a wolf. White silver, enormous, its fur carrying the faint luminescence of the flowers around the pool's edge. Its eyes were gold. Not amber. Not yellow. Gold, the same gold as the changed moon, as the light that had led her here, as the glow she had been hiding beneath her torn sleeve since the palace steps. The wolf looked at her the way nothing had ever looked at her before. Like she was already known. Elara Dawn Vale. The voice again. Coming from inside her ribs. Coming from the reflection. That is not my name, Elara said aloud. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. My name is Elara Wren. I am an Omega from the servant quarters of Moonspire Palace. I have no bloodline worth recording. I was rejected tonight by the Alpha King in front of his entire court, and I am standing in a forest talking to water. The wolf in the reflection did not move. It held her gaze with the patient, absolute certainty of something that has been waiting long enough that a few more seconds of denial cost it nothing. Then, without sound, without movement, it simply stayed. Present. Unwavering. The way a truth stays when you have finished arguing with it. Elara felt it before she understood it. A warmth at her collarbone, not pain, not heat exactly, more like pressure releasing, like something that had been held shut for 22 years loosening one careful degree. She looked down. At the base of her throat, where she had always had a birthmark she'd been told was a common irregularity, a shape was emerging. A crescent. A flame. Silver gold against her skin, brightening steadily, as though the seal Mother Nessa's priestess had placed on it at birth was responding to something the rejection had unlocked. Pain, she understood distantly, was the key. The scratches on her arms began to heal. Not close, slowly, heal, gold light moving through each line the way water moves through cracked earth, filling and sealing, leaving no mark. The torn hem of her gown stilled. The cold that had been in her bones since she walked away from the platform receded. The forest responded. Silver flowers opened further. The ancient stones pulsed once with warmth. Somewhere above the treeline, the golden moon burned brighter, as though it had been waiting for exactly this confirmation. Then the light beside the pool gathered. Not summoned. Not dramatic. The way dawn gathers, with the quiet authority of something that has always been coming. Lunara stood at the water's edge. She was not what Elara had imagined a goddess would be. No towering height, no commanding thunder. She was still and luminous and ancient in the way the stones were ancient, not old but prior. Her eyes carried the particular grief of someone who has watched something precious be endangered for a very long time and has finally been permitted to speak. She did not begin with Elara's importance. She began with the truth that mattered more. You were never abandoned, Lunara said. Every year you spent invisible, every insult you absorbed without breaking, every morning you woke in those cold corridors and decided to survive. None of that was punishment. Pause. It was protection. The people who hunted your bloodline were looking for a Dawn Vale heir who looked like one. So we hid you as something they would never bother to see. Then she showed her. Visions moved through the pool's surface like memory made visible. Aureline Dawn Vale standing at the first Moonbound Flame, her hand on the Wolf King's chest, her bloodline binding itself to the covenant willingly, freely, as an act of love not servitude. The Dawn Vale sanctuary falling, hunters moving through firelit corridors, a wounded priestess running with an infant pressed to her chest. A door in the lower city. Mother Nessa's hands, young then, steady, receiving a child who was already too quiet, already learning the first rule of survival. Stay small. Stay invisible. Stay alive. Elara watched Mother Nessa look down at her infant face and make the decision that would cost her 22 years of lying to a kingdom she served. She had not been discarded. She had been carried, carefully, through the most dangerous terrain imaginable, by a woman who had no reason to take the risk and had taken it anyway. Elara pressed her hand to the crescent mark at her collarbone and felt Solen, her wolf, her true wolf, sealed since birth and waking now, rise fully for the first time. Not with aggression. With recognition. I know who I am. Lunara looked at her with something that was not quite a smile and was not quite grief and was entirely the expression of someone watching a long story finally reach its rightful page. The kingdom that rejected you, she said, must now see what it cast away. The Moonbound Flame was almost gone. What remained in the crystal basin was less a fire than a memory of one. A thin thread of light pressing itself against the basin's far edge as though trying to hold on through will alone. The temple chamber had grown cold enough that breath was visible. Priestess Talia stood at the basin with her hands at her sides and her face composed in the way it had been composed all evening, which was to say at great personal cost. In the courtyard above, the panic had stopped pretending to be calm. Wolves throughout the palace grounds had begun to feel it physically, a hollowing sensation in the chest, the inner beast losing its footing the way a man loses his footing on ice. She was still Elara. That was the first thing, and the most important thing, that every person in that courtyard registered. The same dark hair, the same face, the same slight frame that nobles had stepped around without seeing for 22 years. But the pale torn gown was threaded now with silver flame that moved without burning. The crescent mark at her collarbone blazed gold-white, steady and unmistakable, the same mark that had just written itself in fire on an altar below the temple. And behind her, not solid, not fully of this world, but present in the way that certain truths are present even when you cannot touch them, Solène moved. The sacred wolf. White silver, luminous, her gold eyes carrying the same patient certainty they had carried in the forest pool reflection. The courtyard that had laughed at Elara Wren did not laugh now. The noble daughters who had covered their smiles with jeweled hands stood with those hands at their sides, their faces doing the slow, difficult work of people who are understanding what they have done. Celestia looked at Elara once. Then she lowered her eyes. Lord Cashin had gone completely still. He understood, before Lunara spoke a single word, that what he had spent 11 years managing had just become unmanageable. Draven could not look away. He had looked at Elara in the sacred circle and seen an Omega in a torn gown and made the fastest, most certain, most catastrophic decision of his reign. He looked at her now and saw the same woman exactly, not improved by power, not made worthy by revelation, and understood with a clarity that felt like falling that she had always been this. He had simply refused to see it. Lunara's voice crossed the courtyard without effort. This woman is Elara Dawnveil. Last living heir of Oraline, the first Luna. The bloodline that bound this kingdom's blessing at its foundation. She let that settle for precisely as long as it needed to. You mocked her. You laughed at the blood that carries your wolf's strength, your flame's fire, your bond to the moon. Not a question. Not an accusation. A record being set straight. Then she turned to Draven, and the courtyard held its breath. You rejected the blood your throne was built to protect. The courtyard had never been this quiet. Not during ceremonies, not during declarations of war, not during the 3 winters Draven had ruled through crisis. Those silences had been held silences, performed, political, the kind a court produces when it knows it is being watched and chooses its stillness accordingly. This was different. This was the silence of 500 wolves who had run out of certainty at the same moment. Draven looked at Elara for a long time. Then he did what no one in the courtyard had expected, least of all him. He knelt. One knee. Clean and deliberate, without being prompted, without Lunara asking it of him. His crown caught the silver gold light and held it. His hands rested on his raised knee, open, not clasped. The posture of a man making himself legible, not performing contrition for an audience. I chose wrong. His voice was even, carrying the way it always carried across the courtyard, but carrying something different in it now, the sound of a man who has stopped editing himself. I chose what the council told me was stable. I chose what the court told me was appropriate. I chose what Lord Cashin told me was necessary. Pause. My wolf knew. I silenced him. That is not a defense. It is an explanation of the specific way I failed. Noctur went quiet inside him. Not healed. Not satisfied. Quiet in the way a wound goes quiet when the body finally stops fighting the truth of it. The first step, and only the first step, toward something that might eventually become repair. Lord Cashin stepped forward from the edge of the platform. He had composed himself. That was the thing about Cashin. He was composure all the way down, layers of it, each one designed to protect the one beneath. Your Majesty, this performance of accountability before an unconfirmed claimant. The moonbound flame moved. Not the dying thread in the temple basin. The ceremonial brazier on the platform, the one that had recoiled from Celestia, that had bent toward Elara, that had been guttering at half-strength since the rejection. It flared once, sudden and focused, and the light it cast fell directly on Lord Cashin with a particular quality of light that refuses to be flattering. His council seal, the silver medallion at his chest that marked his authority over the royal advisory, began to darken. Celestia was gone. Cashin was gone. Draven stood behind Elara and did not touch her and did not speak and did not try to insert himself into the image she made standing there. That restraint was the first correct thing he had done since she walked into the sacred circle. Elara looked east, toward the sun coming up over the mountains, over the forest where Solène had woken and Lunara had spoken and a pool had shown her the truest reflection she had ever seen. She thought about a priestess running through fire with an infant and 7 words and the decision to trust a stranger with something irreplaceable. She thought about Mother Nessa's cold corridors and careful warnings and 22 years of lying to a kingdom to keep one child alive. She thought about the girl who had walked away from this platform with her chin up and nothing else. That girl had not needed saving. She had needed finding. And she had found herself, not in a king's recognition, not in a court's approval, not in the moon's light or Lunara's declaration or the restored flame burning gold and silver behind her. In the pool. In the forest. In the moment she said, "My name is Elara Wren," to a reflection that answered, "No. Your name is Elara Dawnveil," and the truth of it had moved through her bones before her mind could refuse it. She had never been beneath the throne. The throne had always depended on her blood. She turned back to the flame, and it burned brighter when she looked at it, and Solène stood at her shoulder like something that had always been there, and the morning came in full. Elara Dawnveil does not fall into Draven's arms. She stands before the restored moonbound flame and lets the dawn arrive. The kingdom finally sees her. She no longer needs their eyes to know her worth. And if you stood with Elara from the moment she was rejected to the moment she chose herself, subscribe and join this storytelling family. Write in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know which country witnessed Elara Dawnveil rise from shame to power. And if you want another story where the rejected woman becomes the one no kingdom can survive without, stay with this channel, because more thrilling stories are coming.